As we begin Lesson 2, we're going to continue looking at evangelism in our postmodern world. I want to talk today about the power of story. As I said in Lesson 1, I first learned to do evangelism by memorizing various logical, rational presentations of the gospel. The Four Spiritual Laws by Campus Crusade and Evangelism Explosion by D. James Kennedy of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church were two of the methods that I used frequently. It seemed in the 1960s and 70s that these presentations seemed fairly effective, especially when I was living in the Midwestern states of the United States. There were still many people in that region who, though unsaved, had Christian memories. They could even tell you which church they maybe had gone to Sunday school or which church their parents or grandparents had been a part of. Words like God, Jesus, sin, and salvation had fairly orthodox understandings. As time went on, however, my rational presentation seemed less and less effective, especially after I moved out here to the Pacific Northwest, where I have lived since 1975. Eventually, sad to say, I quit evangelizing because it seems so fruitless. And then I discovered the power of story. Now, that shouldn't have been such a grand discovery because, after all, Jesus was a master storyteller. And in Matthew 13, verse 34, we read that he spoke to the crowd only in parables. Quote, he did not say anything to them without using a parable, unquote. So everything that he said to the crowds, the larger group of people, included a parable, a story, a metaphor, or an analogy. So if Jesus, who came to bring the good news in the first place, told story after story, there was probably something here that I needed to learn as well. And so I started telling stories. My first story, of course, was of my own conversion. Now, depending upon the person I was talking to, I would either emphasize one aspect or another, trying to engage where they were and building a bridge to where their life situation was. But the basic story of my conversion became the major way that I evangelized. So let me tell you my story. I was raised in a wonderful Christian home. My parents were very involved in our local Nazarene church. My dad taught Sunday school. My mom taught children's church for years. My dad was on the board for I don't know how many decades in a row. Very, very involved. They were also involved on district levels, and they went on many work and witness teams. So I came from a very strong churched family. In spite of that, I did not have a personal relationship with Christ. By the time I was 18 years old, or actually 17 years old and a senior in high school, I became quite desperate to enter into a relationship with Christ. And I remember going to an altar of prayer 3 times my senior year of high school, seeking to confess my sins and make a connection with God. And none of those 3 times seemed to work for me. I didn't understand prayer. I didn't understand faith. I didn't understand taking God at His word. And so I left home and went away to college, very frustrated, feeling like I had not been able to make a connection with God. It was while I was a freshman at Northwest Nazarene University, and I was dating a girl, also from Eastern Washington, when one day she asked me the question, "Bob, are you a Christian? I never hear you talk about God." I replied, "No, I'm not a Christian. I've always wanted to be one. I could just never figure out how to do that." The result of that question was that we ended up over at my basketball coach's house, Mr. Elmore Vale, a man that I had come to really admire in playing basketball for him. I knocked on his door late one Wednesday night. "Coach, I want to become a Christian." He led me into his living room, shared some scriptures with me, and I actually ended up kneeling at the couch of his living room, confessing my sins and pouring out my heart to God and asking him, begging him to come into my life and make me the person I knew that he wanted me to be. Well, I finished praying and thanked Coach for praying with me and sharing some scriptures. I took my girl back to her dormitory, and then I began to jog around the campus. I became very agitated, in fact. I was frustrated because once again I felt like I had knelt, I had confessed my sins, I had asked God to come into my life, and absolutely nothing had happened. And as I jogged around the campus, I became angrier and angrier and angrier. I finally stopped somewhere in the middle of the campus and shook my fist at God and said, God, I don't care whether you accept me or not. I will be a Christian whether you like it or not. And with that, I went back to my dormitory. And immediately there were some guys off of the freshman basketball team standing there in the lobby of Chapman Hall. I went up to them and I said, guys, just want you to know I found God tonight, because I knew that Christians witnessed, they evangelized, they told other people about Christ. And they thought that was hilarious, and they just laughed at me. I marched down to my room, went in there, opened up my King James Bible, and I read. Didn't understand anything, but I read because I knew that one thing Christians did was to read their Bibles, and I was going to be a Christian whether God liked it or not. I slammed my Bible shut after I'd read a chapter, not understanding anything, got down on my knees beside my bed and prayed, because one of the things I knew that Christians did was to pray, whether it worked or not. And I lay down and went to bed, still just madder than hops at God. Got up the next day, same thing. I read my Bible, I prayed, and I witnessed to people. All the while, I'm just royally ticked off at God because I don't feel any difference. I don't feel forgiven. I don't feel at peace. I don't feel his love. I don't feel anything, but I am going to serve God whether he likes it or not. Second day, I wake up, go to the cafeteria. I'm eating breakfast when suddenly a wave of love washed over me that was so powerful that I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God had indeed forgiven my sins, he had indeed moved into my life, and that I really was adopted as his child. I have never been the same since that moment when love washed over me. I've often wondered why there was this gap between the time when I committed my life to Christ, or prayed and confessed my sins and invited him to move in. Why was there a 2-day gap before I really sensed any of the benefits of God? I really came to the conclusion it was because God did want my will above all else. And so that when I shook my fist at him and said I would be a Christian whether he liked it or not, that was exactly what he wanted from me, because he knew there would be challenges in my life when the only thing that would keep me going were not the consolations of the Spirit, not the warm and fuzzy feelings, but it was because I had made a covenant with him and he with me, and we were going to walk this life together, whether it was good or happy or blessed or not. And so from that moment on, I began to share my faith. Now, I didn't always walk obediently with the Lord. I went through a period of time, in fact, when I really fell from grace into works and legalism. And I began to get the idea that though I had been initially saved by the grace of God and overwhelmed by his love, now that I had messed up a few times, I was going to have to basically save myself through my hard efforts, through my discipline, my own righteousness. And so I worked like a dog and became a true elder brother, criticizing other people who did not work as hard as me, and yet never feeling the love of the Father like I had initially, feeling like I was always on the outside looking in. And it was, as I've said before, a very difficult time until once again God awakened me to the reality that I am initially saved by grace. I am being saved by grace today, and I will be saved by grace forever. It's always by grace. So that was my story, and that's what I began sharing with people. Along with my own story, I then began using the stories of Jesus evangelistically. For instance, in Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells 3 stories: a lost sheep, a lost coin, and the 2 lost sons. Again, depending upon the person I was talking to, I would use one or more of those 3 stories to build a bridge to them, to share the good news. For instance, take the story of the lost sheep. Here we have a shepherd, has 100 sheep. One of them goes astray. So he leaves the 99 and he goes and looks for the one lost one. And he searches until he finds it, and then he puts the little sheep on his shoulder and brings him back home, and he calls the other shepherds together. Rejoice with me, because this sheep of mine that was lost is now found, and they have a big party, a celebration. Do you know how sheep get lost? I used to raise sheep for my 4-H projects. Sheep get lost a nibble at a time. A nibble here, a nibble there, and pretty soon they have wandered so far away from the flock they do not know where they are. And unlike almost any other animal on earth, they cannot retrace their steps or smell their way back home. They're lost until a shepherd finds them. Well, people often end up lost, just like this sheep. A nibble at a time. A small decision here, a small event there, and pretty soon they end up far from God. They didn't mean to end up far from God. In fact, they often are surprised to find themselves so far from God. Recently, I placed a woman in a homeless shelter who had once upon a time been part of a very thriving church in our community. But a nibble here, a nibble there, she ended up with a substance abuse problem, living on the streets. She didn't mean to. She wasn't some hardcore rebel against God. In fact, when we prayed together before I put her in the shelter, she prayed with real affection for the Lord. But she still needs help coming back home. The parable of the lost sheep speaks powerfully to people who have made a series of bad choices and have ended up far from Christ and the church, though they may have a real appreciation and even affection for him. They often respond to a shepherd who would leave the others behind to come and look for them without judgment and without condemnation. And so when we run into people that have made a series of bad choices, we can share the story of the lost sheep and talk about a shepherd who, with no judgments and no condemnation, quoting even John 3:17, for the Son of Man didn't come to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. So Jesus comes looking for lost sheep, looking for those who, a decision at a time, found themselves farther and farther and farther away from God. So we can share our own story. We can also share the stories of Jesus to help people realize the nature of the good news. The parable of the lost coin is another way of connecting with a different kind of person. In that story, a housewife is searching diligently for a lost coin. Now think about it. Coins cannot lose themselves. Coins are lost through the carelessness or neglect of another person. So through no fault of their own, they end up lost, and there are people like that. I have consulted victims of child molestation and neglect and abuse who have felt terribly unworthy of God's love. They've often thought that they were such bad people, they deserved what they suffered. What a joy to tell them the story of a God who searches diligently for them, who lights lamps in the darkness, who sweeps under the beds and in the corners looking for them. And when he finds them, he's so overjoyed he throws a party because someone precious to him, of high value to him, has been found. And so people who have been damaged often relate to the story of the lost coin because that's what they feel like. They feel like lost coins. They don't even feel like they have any value. And to realize that there's a God looking for them intently really, really connects.